Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to today's global webcast. My name is Laura Berry, Chief Executive Officer of Supply Nation, joining you from Australia. And it's my pleasure on behalf of the Global Supplier Diversity Alliance to welcome you all to our final webcast to round out GSDA's three-part series. For those of you who joined us for our corporate and our MBE sessions over the past couple of weeks, I'm sure you'll both agree with me that both of those sessions provided our audience with a great insight into the corporate and the MBE experience across the COVID-19 pandemic, a pandemic which is far from over, as we still see significant spikes in infections in various regions around the world, including here in parts of Australia. Now we're all looking to adjust to what's going to be a new normal. Tonight, I'm joined by my fellow global presidents, Cassandra, Gary and Mayank, to talk about how we as Supplier Diversity Councils have navigated the past few months in our respective countries and our key focus areas for the Global Supplier Diversity Alliance and our regions. And I acknowledge that we do have guests joining us today from around the world. So thank you to all of you for taking the time out of your days or your mornings or your evenings to participate in today's session. Sean, if we could move to slide 1, please. The Global Supplier Diversity Alliance is a company limited by guarantee. We incorporated the company earlier this year, and our main purpose is to expose underrepresented minority business owners to mainstream supply chain opportunities and help through that create thousands of jobs in some of the most deprived regions. By doing this, we ultimately play a major role in building sustainable communities. We do this by driving the inclusion of minority-owned businesses within corporate supply chains in our regions and across the world, and providing global corporations with a single point of access to up-to-date research, in-country business intelligence and the best practices around supplier diversity. But we also give our minority business owners in our regions the opportunity to access information networks and business intelligence so that they can look to trade globally. We also bring together advocacy networks from across the world to champion and drive supply diversity and inclusive procurement. Next slide, please, Sean. The GSDA structure, we have our founding directors, Mayank, Cassandra, myself and Gary, and our advisory group made up of supplier diversity professionals from some of our global corporations, Teresa Harrison from EY, Rondu Vincent from Bristol Myers Squibb, Nedra Dickson, who has joined us today and will be providing some opening remarks for everyone, Will Holmes from GSK and Helena Hutton from Cummins. Our closing remarks today will be from Raul Cerez Rodriguez from Merck and Andrea Finmanen from IBM rounds out our advisory group. This group provides the GSDA presidents advice and insight as we further develop the GSDA offering for global corporations who are looking to expand their supplier diversity programs around the world. Next slide, please, Sean. The GSDA organisation focuses on 3 pillars of activity: knowledge, network and advocacy. And you can see on this slide, under each of those 3 pillars, some of the activities that we are undertaking currently, as well as some activities that we are further developing as GSDA continues to grow and gain momentum. We have now finalising our 3rd webinar in this series, and we will soon be setting up our very first global virtual trade show in October of this year. And this really provides an opportunity for our minority business enterprises to meet each other, to meet global corporations and to look at the opportunities to trade globally. That's something that we're really looking forward to. But we also share information across the councils. We provide information to our stakeholders and we get together at usually at the NMSDC conference once a year in the United States. This year we'll be doing everything virtually, and we really look forward to being able to reach a greater audience of people who may not otherwise be able to participate in these sorts of activities. Next slide, please, Sean. So without any further ado, please let me introduce our co-host for today's webinar, Nedra Dickson, Accenture's Global Supplier Inclusion and Sustainability Lead and the Managing Director of Accenture's Procurement Plus. Over to you, Nedra.
Thank you, Laura. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. I'm thrilled to be working with GSDA as a member of the advisory board, and I think this webcast series has really helped to elevate the issue of global supplier diversity with the broad audience and give us the opportunity to engage in a way that we haven't done before. So congratulations to the GSD founders and presidents for pulling it together. We have all faced unprecedented crisis situation over the past 4 or 5 months, and this is a crisis that has impacted all over the world, our lives and businesses, regardless of the size, financial status, or location. However, we've heard during the very first 2 webcasts that this has also provided an opportunity for minority business entrepreneurs to rethink, revive, and reset their businesses to survive the impact of COVID-19 and succeed into the future. It has also presented opportunities for corporations like mine at Accenture to look for new avenues of opportunity for MBEs in our supply chains to work with our suppliers to support them and pivot and adapt to the rapidly changing landscape. Today is the 3rd and final webcast, as Laura mentioned, in the series. So today we get to hear from the GSDA presidents, Laura, Cassandra, Gary, and Mayank. These are our leaders of supplier diversity councils around the world who are advocating tirelessly for the inclusion of minority-owned businesses in their jurisdictions. They all work tirelessly for the cause and work so well together as a unit driving Global Supplier Diversity Alliance as well. We will hear now how their organizations work in country to drive the agenda for minorities they represent. We will also hear more about how they engage the right stakeholders to help their members build great supplier diversity programs and advocate for a policy change as well. So how do they keep supplier diversity relevant and at the forefront of their members' agenda? So many competing priorities, and what do the council's presidents think the futures hold in this space in the coming years? I must tell you that I'm personally really looking forward to hearing from each one of them, and I know our discussion today will be very thoughtful and insightful. But before we proceed, a little bit of housekeeping. As always, we want this webcast to be very interactive as possible, so ask a lot of questions. Importantly, to achieve the best sound quality, make sure that everyone have their microphones on mute. If you would like to ask a question, please put your questions in the QA box on your screen, and we will try to get to as many of them as we can. If you have any comments for the broader audience, please use that chat function. I think we've all been on enough virtual webcasts that we are aware how that works. Today's session will be recorded and available on the GSDA website at the end of the series. I would now like to hand over to our moderator today, Mr. David Ward, Principal of Vantage Partners UK. David has deep expertise in the international leadership, team management, and dynamic changing business environments. Having led teams for major organizations such as GSK, Merck, Siemens, across multiple geographies, including Europe, the emerging markets, and Asia, among his many positions, David is a former chairman of the MSD UK and continues to be a strong advocate for diversity. He is based in the United Kingdom. David?
Wonderful. Nedra, thank you so much for that introduction. Very much appreciated. Welcome everybody to this 3rd in the series. We are glad to be with you again. We're hoping you're not too zoomed out at the moment and that today is going to be an exciting engagement with some leaders in the diversity space. So we've got some good questions for them. I'm going to try my best to challenge a few of them in terms of the thinking and to get them to share with us as much as they can about what their groups are about and what they think they can be achieving as we go forward. As both Laura and Nedra have said, we've seen some really significant challenges across the world over the last few months. The COVID-19 crisis has highlighted many challenges across a lot of societies around the world. Not only the disease, the virus itself, but then the consequences of that to communities, particularly disadvantaged communities, who seem to be often at the forefront of these challenges. It's interesting to note as well that in many countries, we look to the lowest paid people to support us during these times of crisis. Here in the UK, of course, the NHS staff are working tirelessly to help keep people safe and well and healthy, and yet they're often ignored as part of our society. So interesting that these things come to light. As Nedra said, we've also seen now, and we've heard over the last few webinars, that diverse suppliers have stepped up, that they've looked for opportunities, that they haven't allowed themselves to be dissuaded from what they do and what they do best. In fact, they've had opportunities to demonstrate that they can really deliver in times of crisis. Where it's been possible, they've rethought their organizations, they've tried to reinvent themselves, they've tried to rebuild strategies around this new normal that we're now all living in. And in doing that, they've shown a high degree of agility and a high degree of capability, the very things that a lot of their potential customers, particularly in the large corporations, would be looking for. Many of them have seen opportunities materialize that perhaps weren't there before. And now the hope is that those opportunities become sustainable over time as the world moves into whatever the next phase of the virus and the next phase of our new normal actually looks like. And I'm sure very few of us can predict that. But what we can predict is that we're in a time of unprecedented change, that change will continue. It is the one constant, change is the constant, and that diverse suppliers have demonstrated consistently an ability to react and to manage change and to demonstrate their agility for their clients. So I think we might hear some more of those themes as we go forward. So I'm going to allow each of the panelists to introduce themselves. I'm going to call them one by one. And the first thing we want to do is understand diversity in the space that we're talking about. So supplier diversity is a global challenge, is a global endeavor that we're all focused on. However, it has a lot of nuances depending on the part of the world, the country, the society, the communities that you live in, and those communities that your organizations try and serve and sell to. So we're going to understand a little bit more about that context before we then move into some broader questions. So if perhaps I could start with Laura again in Australia, if that's possible. And Laura, welcome. And I'd like to ask you, Laura, to talk to us a little bit about yourself, but about your organization and about the supplier diversity environment in Australia, please.
Thank you, David. So I've been the CEO of Supply Nation now for just over 5 years, and I joined the organisation after sitting on the board for a couple of years, but also out of being on the member side of the equation. So I worked for 2 of the founding corporate members of Supply Nation before I was working for Supply Nation as an organisation. So I brought with me, I guess, some experience of the organisation. I'd been involved in it since it started back in 2009, but very much looking at how we could integrate Indigenous businesses into our supply chains at a corporate level. Supplier diversity, from the moment it was introduced to me, which was back in about 2008, when our founders came and pitched the idea to founding corporates around Australia, it absolutely resonated with me, and I've been hooked on it ever since. My father, I've got an Aboriginal background. My father was an Aboriginal small business owner. I saw how he, grew his business, but I also saw what the difference contracts, and in particular in his case, government contracts made to his business. So going from the day-to-day work and managing cash flow and trying to work out where the next job was coming from, to then having the security of a contract with a large government entity, really changed his business. So when this whole concept was first introduced to me, I was absolutely hooked from the get-go, and I was an absolute champion for it within our corporate organisations. And then when I had the opportunity to step up and take on the role of CEO in 2015, I jumped at the chance. So very honoured to be in this role. As I mentioned, we've been around for just over 10 years now. We are a national organisation. We have offices in Sydney and Brisbane and Melbourne and Canberra and Perth. We're a staff of about 35. And the minority group that we focus on here in Australia is our First Nations people, so Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander business owners. For those of you who don't know, Indigenous people in our country, we make up about 3% of the Australian population. But if you look at Indigenous business ownership, it's still under 1% of Indigenous Australians own businesses. We are historically underrepresented. We, in all facets of society, we still have a huge gap in things like life expectancy, in education outcomes, in other health outcomes, in infant mortality rates, in all those things. And so, as a minority group who we should be cherishing in our country, we still have a long way to go to bring Indigenous Australians up to anywhere near parity with non-Indigenous people. So Supply Nation was started so that we could start to provide an economic vehicle to bring Indigenous Australians into the mainstream economy and give them an opportunity to, I guess, chart their own destiny. We started with full government funding and a group of founding corporate members, and our corporations really drove the engagement for the first 5 years or so of the organisation. But in the last 5 years, our federal government introduced an Indigenous procurement policy, and we've seen significant growth. Our Indigenous business economy is growing at about 13% versus about 3% of the broader Australian business economy, and this is pre-COVID numbers.
Yep.
And the Supply Nation directory went from about 500 businesses in 2015 to now over 2,500 businesses. So we have some great levers in our country now to try to drive the growth for Indigenous businesses. We have our federal government with an Indigenous procurement policy and targets around contracts and spend. We have our state governments who are now introduced Indigenous procurement policies as well, but also the corporate sector really continuing to step up. And last year, with the Business Council of Australia, which represents the top 120 corporations in Australia, Supply Nation partnered with the BCA to develop what we call the Raising the Bar program. And that's at the moment 17 of Australia's largest corporations committing to a target for Indigenous procurement. And we worked for almost 2 years to develop the framework for those corporations to be able to report and to build capability and to participate in that as, I guess, the leaders in the corporate sector for engaging with Indigenous businesses. So we've got lots going on, and we had great growth before COVID. Obviously, COVID's put a bit of a dampener on things, but we as an organisation have also had to pivot during that as well, and we're looking to provide avenues and opportunities to promote not only the opportunities on the member side, but also the suppliers who are providing products and who are pivoting to take advantage of those opportunities, as you mentioned, David, those who are being agile and innovative through this period. So I'm really looking forward to tonight's discussion, and hope that provides a good context of the Australian view.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Laura, and great to hear about your context and hear about the nuances of supplier diversity in your marketplace. I'm sure that's been interesting to everybody. And also the themes that you're talking about, I'm sure will resonate: underrepresentation, but then the endeavors of people like yourselves, organizations like yourselves, to try and change that agenda. So I'm sure we'll explore that further, but thank you and welcome to the panel. Could I ask Cassandra perhaps to join us now? And Cassandra, it would be lovely to hear from you about you and about your organization and your context in the States. Thank you.
Yes, well, thank you very much, David. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening all. Let me just build on what Laura said. So you're going to hear some common themes as we go through this. To begin with, I came out of corporate, accountant by profession, worked in the corporate for a period of time, and then I started my own consulting firm. So my background is I was a consultant, and then I became a supplier to Campsie, part of the supply base. That was interesting because I didn't know the network, and it sort of introduced me to this whole world of diverse suppliers and our connection with corporate. It's amazing that I started to make use of that network, going to the US, going to the NMSDC, and start seeing as was building. 10 years ago, the former CEO and the founder CEO in the Canadian Campsie, he left. And he tapped me on the shoulder and said, Cassandra, would you be interested in taking this role on? At the time, I was like, got a job, not interested. But the more I thought about what we were trying to achieve and the progress he had been able to make, it became apparent that it was something that I wanted to take on, and I wanted to be part and parcel of how we move this forward. So 10 years this year, I've been CEO of CAMC. CAMC stands for the Canadian Aboriginal Minority Supplier Council. I say that in particular because that talks to our particular stakeholder group that we're looking at is both Indigenous / or Aboriginal and minority. So in the Canadian context, we are looking at both those distinct groups. Now, when CAMC started in Canada 16 years ago, it was started as an outgrowth of the NMSDC in the US. NMSDC had been going very well, and they've seen some tremendous growth, some tremendous spend. And what they realized is that north of the border, there was a whole country there that the automotive corridor went up there and everything was happening. Why aren't we including diverse suppliers from there? And so we were started actually as a result of automotive coming together with financial services with ICT. So about 8 corporations came together and said, we're going to try to create something similar to what's happening in the US, taking advantage of diverse suppliers in Canada. And so this was a private sector or corporate-led initiative to put this in place. Now, they did go to the Canadian government, but at the time, they were just introducing it to the Canadian government. So we started without any government directive. So while you've heard Laura talk about the Australian government coming on board, Canadian government was an observer only. So this was purely being led by our corporate entities. And so as a result of that, we've seen our corporation, we've seen the private sector grow tremendously and become very involved. And what happens in Canada, I always said, because it's not a directive of Canada, when corporations come on board, they come on board because they understand the business case for why it's important to include diverse suppliers. Now, when we look at sort of across the Canadian landscape, and different pockets of Canada have different particular nuances, and there's different areas of interest. And so we started in Ontario because that's where the bulk of the corporate offices were. So CAMC, of course, has a widespread in central Canada, and then we roll out across Canada. So while we cover from coast to coast, we definitely have more of a concentration in central, and now we're seeing it as we move across to the west, where we have a greater percentage of our Indigenous businesses going on, and then to the east, it's a smaller portion in the east, but again, we're more, there's more in the eastern side. We have shipbuilding, we have sort of more government contracts, we have some resource fisheries down that way. So it's a very different spread as you look across Canada. When you look at the makeup of Canada, we're probably 36 million people in total. Could be a little bit more than that now. About almost a quarter or 22% of that are minority, and another for 4.9 or 5% of it is Indigenous or Aboriginal. Okay. So again, much like Laura, while we'll have numbers like that, when we look at the amount of business involved and what goes on in Canada, we see a high underrepresentation from those distinct groups, whether they be in government contracting or whether they be in corporate. And so the whole purpose of what we're trying to do is how do we remove any of those barriers in between and move the suppliers that we bring to the table to the forefront. So as I said, we started out with these 8 corporations. We probably have about 85 corporations now that we work with across Canada, and that number continues to grow. We also started very small on our supply base. We probably have at least 450 to 500 fully certified suppliers, and probably another 300 or so in the wings. So we have a 2-tiered structure. So you can sign on just to be able to see the scope of the activity. But then once you see that, then you can actually become fully certified. Okay. So move into that. In the last couple of years, we've been seeing corporations who have become more diligent about reporting their spend to the point that we're probably seeing about $1 billion in spend with diverse suppliers on a regular basis. And so that's important, but again, that's a tip of the iceberg, as I said, for the underrepresentation about what there could be. So I'm enthused to have that discussion today to talk about where we see the commonalities globally, and that we can actually build on those strengths to grow supplier diversity and to grow the diverse spend across the globe. So thank you very much.
Great, and welcome to the panel, Cassandra. Thank you for that introduction. Great context again. Already hearing these themes of underrepresentation and what we can do to try and address that challenge. And I like the fact you've introduced the idea of the business case for inclusion as well as the ethical case for inclusion. So thank you for that. Welcome to the panel. So if I could ask Mayank to join us now. So Mayank from MSD UK, welcome to the panel. And Mayank, if I could ask of you the same question really. Talk to us about your organization some of the context for supplier diversity as it looks in the UK and the United Kingdom market.
Thank you, David, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. One of the things that I really like about GSTA is all of us are so passionate. You heard from Laura, you heard from Cassandra, Gary, you're going to hear, and four of us as a team, we are absolutely passionate about bringing and impacting this change that we all are working together on. Just to give an introduction to MST UK, it actually incubated from my PhD that I was doing when I came from India back in 2000, and I started my PhD on supplier diversity back in 2002. And as a part of that, I went to States on my research trip, met a number of leading American organizations that had done so much around supplier diversity and so much with minority businesses, and ended up attending the conference, NMSDC conference in Los Angeles. And almost there, it was like I was at the right place at the right time with the right people, because there was a growing impetus about an appetite for within American corporations to take supplier diversity globally in countries where they have major operations. And the UK was, at that time, gateway to Europe, which it no longer is. But
don't you dare mention Brexit, Mike.
But I think it was at that time, what we did was we started a pilot project that was funded by the government agency for 2 years to test the business model of an MSDC, and that led to formation of MST UK in 2006. We started with around 15 corporations that majority of them were American corporations. But when you look at the history of immigration in this country, it links directly with the British Empire and the colonialism. And when you want to understand how we define ethnic minorities, in our population census, we have first category, whites and non-whites. And within whites, we have white British, white Irish, and white others. And then non-whites are all those people that have come from the ex-colonies, from Asian subcontinent, from African subcontinent, and the Caribbean, and then Middle East and China. So we have those people who are classified in the non-white category, and those are the people that are considered as ethnic minorities in this country, in the UK. And they constitute 20% of British population, and 7% of those of our total businesses in this country are owned by ethnic minorities. So, and they contribute approximately 30 billion to the British economy. So that's just some sort of gives you an idea of the scale of minority business community as such in this country. It's still very underrepresented throughout public sector procurement and in private sector procurement. And that was what basically, if I look at supplier diversity, I always think that supplier diversity has a huge role to play when it comes to economically empowering these communities, these marginalized communities.
Yeah.
Because what it does, it encourages entrepreneurship in those communities. And by encouraging entrepreneurship, you are indirectly or directly helping create more jobs, create more wealth in the community, those communities, and it helps raise the living standards. That leads to more better education attainment, better health. COVID-19 has seen disproportionately how ethnic minorities are, suffering and are underrepresented in every, and also, how social injustices also that we see all around the world links with the economic deprivation of these communities. So I think supplier diversity has a major role to play. We currently are fortunate that we are having great support from our corporate members, but we don't have public policy push, which is what is lacking in this country. Yeah. We are campaigning to the government about making supplier diversity mandatory in public procurement. There is also lack of data around ethnic minority businesses, because in this country, the government doesn't measure ownership of the business. We are pushing for that. So we are at the moment running a campaign, and also just commissioned the biggest ever research on ethnic minority business and its impact on the British economy. And the aim is that we will keep pushing the government for making supplier diversity mandatory in public procurement. and also starting monitoring of ownership of business in this country. Hopefully, I'm really interested in having further conversation about some interesting things that we are going to discuss together.
Yeah, we are, and I've known you a long time now, Mike. So thank you for that, and you're a tenacious advocate for diversity, and that's to be applauded by everybody, I'm sure. So thank you for that introduction to you and your organization. Welcome to the panel. We are going to pick up on some of those themes, particularly interested in thinking about policy and what policy looks like, across different contexts in diversity. But thank you for that. Could I now invite our final panelist, Gary, to join us, please? So Gary, if you're there, if you could join us from South Africa and talk to us a little bit about your context and your organization, please, Gary.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone.
Hi.
Thanks, David, and thanks to my fellow panelists. Just a bit of background about myself. I'm the Chief Executive of the South African Supplier Diversity Council. My journey to the SASDC starts with me having spent some time within the public sector, looking at small business development and economic inclusion. Out in one of the lowest populated parts of the country, but the biggest land mass or land area in the form of the Northern Cape, and the difficulties associated with starting up businesses within that environment, particularly for previously marginalized Black citizens, was something that I dealt with. I then joined the private sector and for a period of 8 years worked within the private sector for De Beers, the diamond company, in a number of different roles, starting off firstly in the local economic development, small business development component of the corporate social investment and sustainability program of the company, with a focus at the regional level around the mining operations, and then moving into the supply chain environment in response to pending legislation around mining companies needing to empower communities that their mining activity impacts upon. And one of the areas of measurement that mining companies needed to respond to was putting in place procurement plans that would drive the inclusion, not just of local SMEs and local businesses into their supply chains, but also historically disadvantaged South Africans. Okay. Having spent some time there and doing a lot of work within in that space, I came across a program that was funded at that point in time by the United States Agency for International Development, USAID. The program was called the South African International Business Linkages Program. And the focus of that program was to create a market linkage and market access opportunities for Black-owned businesses. And one of the areas identified was corporate supply chains. So I got involved through the program's activities under as part of a working group under one of the implementation partners called the National Business Initiative. And what interested me at that point in time was the elements of supply diversity under discussion and how the business case becomes a driver for driving inclusion, and therefore the change that companies who adopt supply diversity as a strategy within their supply chain, how they are aligning their business processes, how they align their target settings, and how they drive the business case for the benefit of a more inclusive supply chain and therefore a more inclusive economy. Was one of the challenges around the private sector that I experienced at that point in time was that it was really a tick box exercise. It was about meeting the legislative requirements. And yes, we all know legislation sets the minimum standard for anything to be done. And we weren't also seeing the necessary impact. So I joined the National Business Initiative, leaving private sector like my colleagues, and became part of the project in itself, with a goal of setting up an organization through which the institutionalized supplier diversity support can be provided to progressive private sector corporations in South Africa who wanted to drive supplier diversity as a more sustainable solution to a pure tick box BE legislative response. We, as the SASDC, the South African Supplier Diversity Council, we were established in 2011 as an outcome of that project, with the funding from USAID. And I was then appointed as the Chief Executive Officer at the time when the funding shifted from under the program, and we secured additional funding to support the first few years of operation of the SASDC. So I've been the CEO of the SASDC since 2012. As an organization, our focus is on supporting our corporate members with driving sustainable supply diversity programs, supporting them through capacity building, as well as through other best practices that we gain actually through this network of GSDA, and all through the partnerships, through the exchange of different approaches and activities. We take that into our operations and share that with our corporate members to help them drive more sustainable programs. Our focus from a certification perspective as a value add for linking corporations to the targeted groups that they are seeking to do, including their supply chain, is in South Africa, that demographic group is called Black. Black people are anybody in the country that's a citizen since 1994, or the families thereafter that were under the apartheid regime classified as non-white in terms of the apartheid classification systems. So in South Africa, we are actually a majority. 90% of the population falls under the classification of Black. But if we look at the participation in the mainstream economy, South Africa has one of the most unequal societies in the world. And even though democracy dawned on this country in 1994, we haven't made much headway to reduce that inequality. And that inequality, we are seeing changes around representation within the workplace as a result of legislation for employment equity, legislation for skills development that is focused on upskilling Black citizens in the country in order to address the skills deficit that is a legacy of the apartheid system. But within the mainstream economy, we still have high levels of underrepresentation in that regard. On a day-to-day basis, statistics are showing that startups on the part of Black business owners is on the increase. And we have a high percentage of registered firms within this country that are owned by Black citizens. But it doesn't translate at the end of the day into what you see their level of participation is in the economy. So through our certification process, we are helping corporates to identify businesses that have a value proposition that they are able to support, that are legitimately Black owned, Black managed, and Black controlled. Now, my colleagues spoke about legislation and policy within their environments. Since 1994, and officially 1996, when our constitution was adopted in our country, the constitution enables the ruling government or the governing parties and parliament in itself to put in place legislation that is not in conflict of the Bill of Rights that we all are entitled to as citizens, but in essence is deliberately driving all of the inequalities and injustices of the past to create a more equal society within South Africa, society that is accessible to everyone, and with that, an economy that everybody is able to participate in. So we've had legislation that has come in, and what is quite often referred to and known in other parts of the world is our broad-based Black economic empowerment legislation.
Yeah.
And that legislation was brought in place after government in itself, our government, had implemented policies within its procurement space, preferential procurement policies, to drive the inclusion of more small and Black businesses into the procurement space, granting them preference with regards to access to these opportunities. And in order to stimulate more of that transformation, broad-based Black economic empowerment came into being. And one of the measurement elements within that regard is what is referred to as enterprise and supply development. But what enterprise and supply development actually means is supplier diversity. And even though we've got this legislation, it becomes still very much a tick box exercise that organizations and companies are implementing in response to that regulation. And it's viewed as a tax.
Yes.
And not actually as a value addition. So the biggest challenge that we sit with as an organization is we've got a legislative framework that provides companies with a clear, input-driven response to the inclusion policies of government, but a very minimalistic approach to it. And with us at the same time saying there's a strong business case for us to be driving the inclusion within the supply chains. And I'm looking forward to sharing more of this information with the members of my panel. As the council, we have about 29, almost 30, I think 30 corporate members.
Okay.
And about 830 businesses that we've certified on our books. As well as an extended network of over 3,000 additional Black businesses that we've interacted with and engaged with in a variety of different projects. And that ecosystem is what we managed at a national level. And Global Supply Diversity Alliance is a mechanism through which we want to go beyond just looking at opportunities within South Africa, but how those businesses within our ecosystem, these Black businesses, can also partake within the global economy instead of being left behind in that space as well.
Sure.
Thanks,
Wonderful.
David.
Gary, thank you so much. A very good context setting for your marketplace and the challenges you're facing. Thank you. We're going to jump across the Southern Hemisphere. I want to go back to Laura. Laura, thanks for staying up with us this evening for the panel. Let's start by talking about the role of advocacy groups. The GSDA is successfully bringing together some advocacy groups such as yours into a global collective. But I want to talk a little bit more. So what is the role of advocacy groups? How can you support and enable a change management agenda? And how perhaps can you educate without just being seen as somebody who's preaching a policy that others may or may not agree with?
That's a very good question. I think well, it depends where that change management agenda is actually taking place. If it's within the corporations that we're working with and we're trying to get them to change their behaviour to procure from diverse businesses, then I think it is important to understand before you start going in and looking like the preacher, you know, where they are in their journey, like how developed are they? Are they a global corporation trying to come in and start a new supplier diversity practice in your country and they've already got some developed programs elsewhere that you can draw on? Or are they starting from scratch because of a variety of different reasons? And in Australia, we refer to them as the 3 Cs. So they're either coming into the supplier diversity space because of a compliance reason, corporate social responsibility reason, or because of a competitive advantage. And mostly when we're starting off, they're coming in because of the CSR angle, or potentially now with policies in place because of a compliance angle. So I think our role is very much to show that we have credibility when we're talking to organisations and asking them to change by drawing on some of those best practice examples from around the world. I mean, one of the big selling points for us in Australia when we talk about supply diversity and its benefits is that, I guess, as the youngest council of all the councils in the GSDA, you know, I'm constantly talking about the fact that we're drawing on international experience, that we're drawing on 45 years plus of experience out of the United States, and that we're regularly sharing that best practice amongst, you know, the fellow GSDA councils. So, you know, I think there has to be a want from the organisation in the beginning, so that you aren't seen to be preaching, and then it's a matter of understanding where they're at, and then how you tailor the response. If you're doing it with government and others around policy change, that's a whole different ball game. But I'll leave it there and see if you've got any other follow-ups.
I'm sure I will, but I want to jump to Cassandra to maybe build on that thought about what is the role of advocacy groups, but also, you know, there's a strong history of diversity and supply diversity coming from the States. You mentioned your sort of heritage of moving from that MSD, the States sort of initiative, into one that's focused around Canadian challenges. Is there a danger that we live with a US legacy only, and that in some way mitigates what you can do locally in your market?
Well, I think you hit on a very good point, because while it started in the US, and I always say that the US started with the race riots in the streets, you know, the haves and the have-nots. And so because there was actually fight in the street, that whole directive and the need for NMSDC became a natural in the US. In the Canadians, we tend to have a whole different attitude about it. But if you lift up the cupboards, we've had as much racial unrest as the US have had, but it's not dealt with the same way. Mm-hmm. But also from a Canadian pride perspective, you're absolutely right. We do not want to replicate the US. That's not who we are, and that's not what we'll play with our government and with our corporations. And so what we're coming at it from the Canadian perspective is that we need to have more of this collaborative model. We need to have more of an integration model. So in Canada, for sure, when we talk about the advocacy group, I don't see us just as an advocacy group, because for me, that's you know, when I think of government, I think of the lobbyists, I think of signing off and saying, this is what we're doing. Yeah. We need to have more of that. So we need to be, it's a fine line between sort of advocacy. We also do certification. We also do connection. We also do education. There's a number of things that bring us together that allow us to present a credible case, a compelling case to corporations and governments that this is where they need to be. When we do so in front of governments, we take people like the EYs, the RBCs, the TDs, we take our corporates with us to the government tables, because we're not presenting from a sort of a self-serving model. We're presenting from having corporates and suppliers at the table saying, this is what makes sense. This is what's driving the economic landscape in Canada. If we're able to do this and we see the benefits of doing this, why would you not take advantage of doing the same things from the government structures? And we've had a number of these sort of trips into our seat of government with our corporate members and our suppliers at heart, to the fact that we now have government saying, this does make sense. We should be doing some pilots. And so it really does take the credibility of having your partners with you. The louder voice, the voices of the ones actually in the trenches, brings that momentum to the table, brings that credibility that Laura's talking about. We also, when we're doing, so with government's one angle to take, when we're seeing more corporations, because you've heard Mayank and Gary talk about, this has been an American initiative. So we have a lot of the Canadian counterparts of the American companies in Canada who buy into it. But the Canadian companies are saying, oh, that's an interesting concept, but I think we're already doing it. What we need to do is we bring our corporates again, having, you know, peer-to-peer, having a CPO call a CPO of another organization, having a CEO call a CEO. We sit at the table and we're able to bring that education, that data to the table that enables them to say, oh, I guess we could be doing that. We thought we were doing that. But when they go dig down into it, they're not quite doing it. Their numbers are very small, but when they're talking to our corporations who are doing it, seeing how they are doing it, because I mean, there's a program, there's a rigorous process around being able to do it and have it sustainable. That's where we come into and bringing the right bodies together, overlaying the research, overlaying the suppliers, overlaying best practices that we can help them with, and have that moving forward.
Wonderful, and I love that idea of peer-to-peer activity. I think that can be very compelling and very strong, and it sounds like it's a route to success for you in terms of getting that message out there and spreading the desire and the need to do something more advantageous in this space. Wonderful. Thank you, Cassandra. Mayank, I'm going to skip over the Atlantic back to you, sir. Give us all your views on the role of advocacy groups like yours, particularly against the current landscape, where we've talked about the degree of change, and perhaps the only thing we can be sure of is just that everything's changing constantly and very fast at the moment. What are some of your thoughts about your role?
I think both Laura and Cassandra has, very eloquently discussed about the role of corporations, role of government. I think one of the things that I want to add is about our role to build businesses of the future, and how can we play a big role in improving the capacity and capabilities of minority-owned businesses. Because if we really want to engage them with corporate supply chains, we need to make sure that they rise to the challenge.
Yep.
They are fit to supply, they're in the right industries, but at the same time, how can we play a major role? Because I think it's important for us to invest in suppliers, invest in business development. And that is one thing that MST UK has been doing significantly more over the last 4 or 5 years, where we are partnering with universities, partnering with a number of financial institutions, number of government-led funded industry organizations and bodies to help us put together an ecosystem where a minority business that is at the start of their journey get a 360-degree support, lifetime support, whenever they need it, to build their business, build a sustainable business model around that so that they can compete with the best. I think that is a big role that we all have to play. Our focus over the last 4 years is also to reach out to young generation, because when I look around supplier diversity—
That makes us sound old, Mayank.
I think we go around universities all across UK to look out for, almost like we are going on a talent scouting, where we are looking for young graduates who want to be in business, who have an innovative idea, to bring them all together and invest in their development so that they are ready and they are offering industry some new ideas, innovation, and also help them build a sustainable business around that. So I think that is one thing that I would say is also a very big part of what advocacy organizations can do to make supplier diversity work.
And I love that idea of working on the other side of the equation. It's easy, and we're going to do some more of it, but it's easy to focus on the big corporates and what they need to do. And they've clearly got the leverage and the resources and the capability to do more. But actually to focus also on the minority business to make them fit to supply, as you said, which I think is, is a really interesting way of looking at it. Do you see a danger that historically minority suppliers, if they have been included, tend to get stuck in the same sort of spend categories, like the cleaning company or the catering company, or do you see that changing as well?
I think it's a very interesting question, David, because COVID-19 has shown us how adaptive minority businesses are to pivot and to look for new areas. We have seen companies who are in chemical industry suddenly try inventing a flogging machine to help organizations do that. We have architectural firms, we have got audit firms who are now going into looking at using technology, especially in the property and real estate, to go and use more technology and come up with ideas that would help organizations manage their real estate. So we are seeing so much of innovation within minority business. And I think it is important because, COVID-19 has shown us that change is going to be constant now. We cannot have a status quo, and we cannot have a business that remains stagnant. I think it's important. And we see minority businesses very adaptable to change, very flexible, thinking outside the box. We set up at the start of COVID-19, we set up an online marketplace, COVID-19 marketplace. And when I started looking at some of those businesses that had promoting their services, I just couldn't recognize them because they were in totally different industry when they joined MST UK. And now they are offering totally different solutions. So that proves that, minority businesses are really at forefront when it comes to innovation.
Wonderful, thank you. Gary, if we can jump back down to you and just perhaps one more question around this centralized theme of advocacy groups. How are you approaching stakeholders? And I guess I'm thinking predominantly corporate stakeholders. And how do you get to the ones that matter, that can truly make a difference? And how do you stop? I think you referenced the tick boxing exercise. How do you get beyond that with some of those stakeholders?
Well, there's a lot of players within our marketplace that are providing consulting-based solutions to companies and buying firms on how they can tick that box most effectively. So what we really, our advocacy and our outreach is really a function of the corporations that we interact with, and the referral process that happens through those different platforms where they have identified through the type of support and the benefits that they derive being part of the SASDC ecosystem. The platforms are alternative platforms where they would share that experience and invoke interest on the part of other corporations. You know, the other area is also through the visibility that we try to create when it comes to the activities that we drive and the programs that we get involved in. Within our environment, because of the huge challenge that we sit with, it is critical that private sector and public sector collaborate effectively when it comes to driving a more inclusive economy, when it comes to implementing projects and programs that will deliver on the sustainable success that they aim to achieve. And that positioning that we have adopted as an organization to be a bridge between public and private sector around programmatic activities, to bring that best practice that makes the policy goals and objectives realizable, is really where we play our role as an organization. The other side is also when there is opportunities to innovate, and even as an organization, we have to constantly innovate around what solutions we put in place to problems that we've identified within the marketplace that are not adequately being addressed, whether it's by policy or by practice. Mm-hmm. And having to ensure that through the innovation that we put in place and to solve those type of problems, that it firstly ensures sustainability with regards to the outcomes that we drive. I have to agree with what Mayank is saying. A key component of our work that we've been doing in the last 2 to 3 years has been focusing on developing and investing in the capability of the Black businesses that we certify within our ecosystem. Yeah. There's a lot of negative perception within the marketplace around the skills, capability, the reliability, the pricing, etc., of Black businesses in South Africa, and a kind of hands-off approach that companies prefer to take. We're starting to see companies needing to do more supply diversity programs that drive into the core procurement commodities and activities of their business, and that becomes a challenge for them. So building the capacity of our suppliers to be able to respond to these new emerging opportunities is what we've been focusing a lot on, and partnering with other organizations in order to bring that capability to our ecosystem, to ensure that at the end of the day, we are a type of one-stop shop. You know, it's quite a cliche to use that term, but we want to be that one-stop shop for our corporate members, where they are able to come and get access to innovative solutions, to get access to the type of services and the activities that can respond to their unique needs, while at the same time creating a strong base and an ecosystem of collaboration and partnership to drive these common goals, whether you are a Black business in this environment, a corporate member wanting to drive supply diversity, or policy and a regulator wanting to see the outcomes of what you do for the better good of the country.
Yeah, wonderful. And thanks for building on that idea of supply development. I think it's important that, and I think we'd all agree that winning business and building your business and developing new customers is based on the fact that you're capable. And it's not a tick box because of your race or your background or your ethnicity. It's actually because you're capable. And so helping to build that and continuing to build that feels like a vital strand of influence that groups like yours could have. Can I jump? Thank you, Gary. Could I jump back over to Laura? Laura, thinking about some of the big corporations, and some of them will be on the call today, what do you think they should be doing? What could they do more of? Are there things that they should stop doing? If in a perfect world, interacting with some of the big global corporations, what would good look like for you as you think about the diversity landscape?
I think the corporations who are looking to engage more in the space, you know, particularly in the current environment, really need to be thinking differently. As you know, Gary just talked a lot about being innovative and you know, adapting to circumstance. And I think the same applies not only for us as advocacy councils in each of our jurisdictions, but also for the MBEs and the corporations. So we're having conversations at the moment with a lot of our corporate members around, you know, where they should be looking differently in their supply chain for diverse businesses. And I think when you say what should they stop doing, and I'm not suggesting for a moment they all do this, but one of the barriers is often a preconceived notion about what it is that an Aboriginal business does.
Yeah.
So, you know, a purchaser or somebody in the organisation thinks, oh, well, that's an Aboriginal business, so they must be able to provide me with some fantastic artwork, or I'll get them in for some cultural competency training, but don't actually realise the breadth of talent that actually sits in our diverse businesses. Yeah. You know, everything from drone surveying to virtual and augmented reality to, you know, huge construction firms winning, you know, some of the biggest government contracts, you know, in partnership with others. So from my perspective, it's really about having, you know, asking our corporations to have an open mind about what the possibilities might be, and thinking differently, not just at the exact suppliers that they might be currently working with, but also, you know, we're finding here in Australia as well, you know, that sharing of corporate to corporate information. So reaching out to peers in other corporations and saying, who are you working with? And, you know, we're looking for hand sanitizer during COVID. Is there an Indigenous business that you're working with that could maybe help us with that? Because that's an avenue I pursued before. So, yeah, I think that, you know, really trying to break down some of those preconceived notions and, you know, maybe unconscious biases that might exist. And from my perspective, you know, don't just engage in Indigenous business for a one-off. Think about what role you play as a corporation to make sure that you've got the systems and processes, you know, set up within your organisation to not only bring that business in a culturally and appropriate manner into the business and into your supply chain, but also to be thinking about what role do you play to help build that capability and to give more opportunity and to not stretch the business too far before they're ready for it. We all have that role to play in the capability building part. And I think in the Australian context, you know, we like to draw on the experience of some of the global corporations who do this supplier mentoring and development and capability building really well, and see how we can apply it here.
Wonderful. Thanks, Laura. I love that idea. The preconceptions and the unconscious bias, really good themes to think about for everybody. Cassandra, in Canada, again, thinking about what good looks like with corporations as regards supply diversity, and perhaps if you've got examples of a good or a bad, that would be interesting as well.
Okay, just to build on, because I think the conversation is going very well, but to build on what I've heard from Laura saying that, I think it's important that the corporations are actually looking for, and I was speaking with someone the other day and we talked about different channels to use suppliers, different channels to use diverse suppliers, because we're putting them in the same boxes, whether it be facility management, logistics, whatever. What are the different channels and how do we grow that? I think that's vitally important as our economy is evolving. But what I think I'd like to focus on is what we started off in one of our one of our corporates, I remember very much when Nedra came on board, we brought Accenture to Toronto to meet with a CPO roundtable to drive supplier diversity. So RBC hosted, we brought up, let's about 8 others on these private CPO roundtables. Let's talk about who's using it, why we're using supplier diversity, and what do we have to do to move forward.
Yeah.
We got some real uptake from that. But there's not enough of that peer-to-peer actually challenging them to use it. It's nice to say, well, we'd like them, we're sort of recommending them to do it. If you believe in something, I'm only dealing with people who also believe in it. Put that out as something that is a mandatory, that it's part of doing business. We have it with the city now, contract language. If you're having contracts with the city, must have supplier diversity and must have a credible program. Yep. So it's not just a tick box to say we like it, we believe in it. What are you actually doing? That's where you get the points for getting this. When we talk about, and most recently, so we have some of our corporations are very good at taking the economic impact report, showing what the impact it is, broadcasting that, and that's what they're doing. They have to be vocal about what they believe. They have to be vocal about their objectives and what they hope to achieve. To say I believe in it, but not to be able to show any stats behind it. How many suppliers are you using? How much has your spend been?
Yep.
That's sort of a black box that we're trying to avoid. Right now, we in North America, globally, are in the throes of Black Lives Matter. We've heard everybody come out, oh, I believe in this, anti-racism doesn't have a role to play. We all believe in the motherhood statements. Those are all wonderful. Mm-hmm. The real onus comes in, what do you do beyond there? What have you actually written down in black and white? What have you put out there from your program? How are you changing that to incorporate that? That's when we start to see what good looks like, as opposed to sort of maybe nice. Nice is I've got a nice letter drafted up. I've done my communications. I've sent it out to everybody. Good and leading edge is my program now has been adjusted to be able to say this. This is what we're going to do in the next year, the next 3 years. And it's going to involve supplier development. It's going to involve, having diverse areas where we can grow suppliers, where we are actually using suppliers, where we pushed our peers, our partners, our tier ones to actually have programs. That's when we start to see that come to bear.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you for that. And I'm sure a lot of people on the call will be cheering and supporting what you've just said about this call to action. And let's actually make sure we're doing things, not just buying into the slogans and the sound bites. Thank you for that. Mayank, can I jump over to you? And I was reading recently, I think it was from SIPS, that firms were being asked to commit 1% of spend to ethnic minority suppliers. This feels very inadequate. And I'd like your views on what you think about the amount of effort firms do need to put into actually genuinely getting representative suppliers into their organizations and in their supply chains.
When I see only 5 of FTSE 100 companies having any supplier diversity initiative in the UK, then I think 1% is a good start, because if you think about 1% and convert that into revenue, it's 18 billion pounds. And if minority business community in this country, in the UK, is contributing 30 billion, you add 18 billion into that, how many more jobs they would create, how much wealth they would create in that community. So I think, yes, I think I was very, very pessimistic and very low on my expectations of 1%. But if I can get in 3 years' time, if I can get at least 50% of FTSE 100 companies being part of MSD UK, make supplier diversity mandatory. Because I think as we have all said, it's about tick box exercise. We need to move beyond that. But I think what's going to change corporate behavior, and I hope that's true, is our young generation who are demanding more. The workforce of the future is asking their employers what they are doing realistically. They are challenging them to move beyond tick box.
Yep.
And if they really want to attract the best talent into their workforce, they need to do more. They need to actually have results that they can announce about what they are doing. So I think, yes, 1% is a very, very low ambition, but I think if I can get 50% of FTSE companies, then I would raise it to 10%, but I think I need to get first corporations in the UK to commit to supplier diversity and make sure that they commit to this. But I just want to add also one more thing, and this is more about, there are so many corporations today on this webinar who are thinking of going global. And what I have, and I think most of my partners across Laura and Cassandra and Gary would agree with me, is that it's very easy to start thinking, okay, we want to have a global program, especially in American corporations. But we have seen so many good examples of how that has translated. But
Yeah.
where it has failed is where you don't get local senior leadership involved. And you start a program with having someone very junior at the lowest level of the procurement ladder to be a champion, but they can't influence anyone.
Yeah.
Their voice is not heard, and
Yeah.
they manage the supplier diversity program. I think that is what my message to companies in America who are trying to go global: make sure that you have senior leadership buying in first, and then have someone who is really passionate, but also who can influence internally. Because when we talk about a young entrepreneur with a new idea, which is going to benefit GSK, for example, they don't need procurement. We need to go beyond procurement. We need to take supplier diversity beyond procurement and get a wider organization involved so that we can have different channels. As Cassandra said, we need to have different channels of entry point, just not procurement, to make supplier diversity work.
And do you see, therefore, that supplier diversity sits within a much broader holistic view of diversity more broadly for an organization, both in terms of employees, in terms of customer targeting, and the whole way an organization thinks about how it engages with the communities that it exists in?
And I think you are really very, very good point, because what I've seen in UK especially is that D&I function focuses just on employee diversity, and they have no connection with procurement and supplier diversity. We need to align these two forces together to make a big difference. When we really want to make difference on supplier diversity, we need to make sure that they also interact very closely with the overall D&I objective in the UK.
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks for that, Maya. Interesting stuff. So thanks for quantifying the 1% there and putting it in financial terms, which certainly gave it a lot more gravitas and perhaps a little bit more importance. Thank you for that. Gary, down to you. From your members, Gary, so the organizations that join a group like yours, how can you support them better? What could you do more of, do you think? What can you bring to the table for them to make them more successful in their goals around supplier diversity?
We really pride ourselves as an organization on focusing on providing fit-for-purpose, tailor-made solutions to each of our corporate members. But for us to better understand that, it requires engagement. It requires much more frequent dialogue, and it requires them to be identifying where their challenges are, instead of identifying the solutions that they want us to implement. And that's a problem within this environment. A lot of people want to tell you what the solution is that they're looking for. But it's difficult to tell them that the solution they're looking for is the answer to the wrong question, because they're not asking the right questions in order to drive sustainability. So that is a focus on what we do as part of our differentiation on our value proposition. But I'd like to also just reflect on what Mayank said. And it came from what you were mentioning, David, and that's around the organization as a whole and how it embraces diversity and inclusion and lives it, is an indication of how effective any of these programs would be.
Yeah.
And aligning the diversity and inclusion goals, whether you were talking from a talent management and an employment equity perspective, or whether you are talking about your corporate social investment and responsibility programs and outreach into disadvantaged communities, and ensuring that you are addressing the challenges within those communities. It's a discussion that needs to be consistent within the organization when it comes to inclusion and representation across the board. And supporting companies with that integration process is something that I think as change agents and councils, we can do quite effectively. To help also break down that internal silos that exist. In South Africa, we see companies that are most successful at their supply diversity programs that goes beyond the tick box exercise, are companies that are reflecting the diversity within all levels of the organization, because it adapts or changes the culture of the organization, and changes the dialogue internally within the organization of why diversity and inclusion is important over and above the workforce, but also in terms of the customer base and how your customer base and your supplier base are linked to each other. And that's where we can really play a role in that regard.
Yeah, spot on. I've advocated for a long time that this connectivity between supplier and customer is way too weak in a lot of organizations, and diversity is just one of many areas where it should be a lot stronger. Thanks for that, Gary. Some good insights there. Laura, back over to you. Have you got some interesting examples you could share of a good collaboration between a group like yourselves and one of your corporate members? And perhaps just embellish and enrich a little bit about, what those good collaborations could look like.
Yeah, look, I think, we have our member organisations who pay Supply Nation a fee and then expect a range of services, in return for that. And one of the challenges faced over time is A, making sure that we're showing that there's value for that, but B, helping the member to understand that part of the fee that they pay to Supply Nation is not just so that they get dollar for dollar service back in return, but actually that also helps to grow and build the Indigenous business sector here in Australia as well. So that's sort of a bit of a learning curve for for some of our members. We're a not-for-profit organisation. We all are in our various jurisdictions. So we don't have a lot of money. There's always a lot of need. And so I think one of the great collaborations we've had with one of our corporate members, the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, has been, an additional funding allocation annually to help us start to build new and innovative programs. So the first round of those was helping us build an online platform to take advantage of the skilled volunteering base in our corporate members, so that, one member paid for us to help develop that and work with our businesses and work with providers for that. But then that's something we can open up to the broader membership, where corporate member can bring their skilled volunteers onto this platform, and our Indigenous businesses actually post a job onto that platform for help that they need. It might be around understanding their cash flow better, or it might be, around a marketing plan. And the system actually now connects them with a skilled volunteer from one of the corporate members so that they can start to do some work, but also, build the capability of the business and build a relationship between the two. So that was sort of the first phase of that we developed over a couple of years. And now we're looking to build on that to provide further capability building for suppliers that comes out of the back of that. So, we've heard a lot about, making sure that for the system and the ecosystem to work well, you have to have the supply there and you have to have the demand there, and really making sure that the supply is meeting the demand and that you've got the capable businesses. For us in Australia, that's a challenge. Many of our Indigenous businesses are small to medium enterprises.
Yeah.
A number of them are quite new to the business sector. And it's very easy for a corporation to say, oh, we only let national contracts, so we can't possibly work with an Indigenous business there. So helping our members to understand that there are opportunities for them to engage in broader than just a transactional way through a membership fee and a service is something we've been doing a lot of work on over the last few years, and we're starting to see more corporations now coming and saying, how else can we be involved and how else can we help? And for a not-for-profit, it's often the only thing that we're held back by is money. We can do anything you like if you give us the resources and the money to do it. So, where we can partner with like-minded organisations to help build our capability that in turn builds the sector, that's what we're always looking for. And that's been a great partnership over the last few years with CBA.
Wonderful, thank you. Cassandra, thanks, Laura. Cassandra, could I jump to you and build a little bit on this, thinking about the engagement with the corporates for organisations like yourselves, and perhaps on some of the things that Gary and Mayank were saying about being part of a broader D&I agenda. Have you found examples where you are talking to more than just the procurement organisation, for example, and you can see a broader D&I agenda in some of your members?
Well, that's certainly, I mean, we started from that in Canada a longer period of time because we found that HR partnered with procurement, and then we also had CSR partnered with procurement. So we saw it in various areas, whether it was the HR component coming together, procurement coming together, sales and marketing. They are bidding on contracts that has a line or all around supplier diversity. So it's sales and marketing usually has more funds than anybody else in the organization.
Yeah.
So if you're able to sell it to the sales and marketing crowd, and they're able to generate more business, a business enabler for them, they're coming back to the procurement people or the SD people saying, who do we have? What does our program look like? We certainly get those calls on a regular basis from our members. So we know sales and marketing, if they're out looking and they see that, they're coming back to your SD people who are saying, we need to have a stronger program, so we're able to do that. If HR, we know from research in Canada, if an organization has, from a D&I perspective, understands a diversity, if that's the foundation of the organization, it's an easy move to get a supplier diversity program in place from the procurement side of the house. So we have these levers from as HR understands it, it's a now foundation, SD gets started. If sales and marketing are seeing it, it comes into SD again that helps the procurement world. So there's a whole sort of a scenario or whole ecosystem that drives it. I just want to say a couple of key things for some of our partners in Canada. We have people like RBC, one of our founding partners, who supply us, much like Laura says, we're not for profit. Supply us resources or our offices across the country if we want to run outreach opportunities. So that certainly helps us, and that gets their people sort of understanding who the suppliers in the region are, and it makes for a better relationship. We have EY, who's part of this Canadian Business Resilience Network, who's bringing the bulk of EY advisors to the table for the suppliers. So our suppliers now can reach out across that network anywhere in the country to be able to access that. We have Accenture, who in the Canadian landscape, we have a collaborative model with our other advocacy organizations, such as CGLCC, WeBe Canada, IWSCC, and we're trying to, as a group of advocacy, come to government. Accenture has, on behalf of that, has put forth a design thinking workshop that all of our bodies are coming together. And what we're trying to do is create, what does SD in Canada look like going forward? And so therefore that's going to enable all of us to build a better environment, a better ecosystem that will drive diversity in Canada on the whole. So there's a lot of great corporate partnerships going on, and we see it, and those guys I'm talking about certainly see it from the HR, from the sales and marketing, from the procurement, from the SD, and from sustainability, and we see it in all those levers together. We just need to be able to have more of the organizations who understand the connection points.
Yeah, wonderful. Great point. Thank you, Cassandra. I'm going to stay with you, if I may, because we're starting to run out on time. So while I'm with you, have you got any perhaps final messages for our audience today from Canada?
Oh, yes, from Canada. Okay. We are safe and healthy here. We welcome all at some point in time. But what I want to be able to say is the global network, what COVID has done, everything has gotten a little bit localized, and people are, we need localized manufacturing, we need regional manufacturing. We still, while we want to have that as a sustainable foundation in any country, globalization beyond borders makes sense. The opportunities we're talking about to be able to cross borders, to be able to link up suppliers from country to country, corporations to be able to identify in different countries, that is still viable, and if anything, that is even more important now as we go forward. So I want people to consider what global means in this evolving environment in which we are, and how we can make the best use of it. Because now we're able, on this technology base, we're able to reach so many people. How do we make use of that and be able to key in on just the suppliers and just the areas we need to focus on? I think it's important.
Fantastic. Thank you. And thanks for your contribution today, Cassandra. Mayank, over to you. Some final words from the UK.
I think, as I remember Teresa Harrison saying that this is not a moment, this is a movement. And I think it's important that we continue to challenge the status quo. We all continue to innovate. We need to think outside the box. GSDA came out from this sort of whole thinking outside the box to come, all of us coming together, because next stage of minority business growth is going global. How can we connect minority businesses in the UK with a business in California or business in Australia? We have already seen so many good examples and case studies of UK businesses partnering and having joint ventures with American minority businesses. So it's important that GSDA plays a big role. I've just put a comment on that I want the regional councils, all the 20+ regional councils of an MSDC, to join hands together with GSTA to connect minority businesses globally. We also want corporations to invest beyond just membership, because it's not about that. It's about, we all talk about good examples. MSD UK has huge partnerships with EY, with Accenture. They are funding our hubs, Innovation Hub and Knowledge Hub. We have got Cummins, who are funding our Innovation Challenge. We are in the process of setting up a center of excellence on supplier diversity. We want to set up a business academy to keep investing in supply chain education for minority businesses. So there's a huge opportunity for collaboration and partnership. So I think that is what I want to see supplier diversity move the needle and start thinking beyond just dollars and pounds. And, so I think that's the message from me.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mayank, and thank you for your time today on the panel. Very much appreciated. Gary, let's jump down to you quickly for a few last words from South Africa.
Thank you, David, and thank you to my panelists. From my side, I agree with what my colleagues has been saying. If there's one place that you are safe to invest in, is with any of the councils that play within the space of supplier diversity. 80% of our annual turnover is from other sources of funding, project related, etc. And only 20% comes from our corporate membership. So we are using those as opportunities to invest into new product offerings and new initiatives that can strengthen the mandate that we have been established to operate within. And partnerships are key to that. So looking at the investments is not gambling. It's not like you put you're playing a slot machine where you're able to put money into the machine, and after one or two pulls, you want to start seeing money flowing out of it. But if we start having a longer term view and start looking more at partnerships on the part of our corporations within our ecosystem, if we start looking more at the global context within which we are operating and how the weaknesses within the conventional practices of globalization have been exposed first 10 years ago to the global credit crunch, and now through something as small as a virus that we cannot even see with the naked eye. It's exposed all of the weaknesses within the system, but it's also brought to the fore the opportunities to change, and with that change, to change the way in which our societies are structured, our economies are structured, and supply chains are a key component of that. So thinking globally but acting locally is enabled through the networks such as the Global Supply Diversity Alliance when it comes to your supply diversity programs. And just collaborating stronger within that space can result in better results being achieved. And all of us have value to offer. It's how we actually pull that value together and ensure that we bring the brightest impact that we can deliver on.
Great, thank you, and thanks for joining us from South Africa today, Gary, much appreciated. Laura, last words briefly from Australia, and thanks for staying up with us.
Nothing I can add that my fellow global presidents haven't already said, so I think I would reiterate everything that's been said by the three that have come before me. This movement isn't going anywhere either. So our councils are here for the long haul. There's opportunity for corporations thinking about operating in different jurisdictions to do it really well, and that's what we're here for. That's what GSDA is all about. It's about trying to make the networking and the introductions and the opportunities easier for both the corporations who are looking to go global, but also for the minority businesses who have goods and services to sell or who are looking to expand their operations. So that's what GSDA is about. We are going to continue to build this organisation. So we've incorporated ourselves now as a proper organisation. We're going to continue to build the offering for our global partners, and we look forward to working with as many organisations as we can and really making this something that hums along. And we're early days with a long way to go. So thank you very much.
Wonderful, and thanks for joining us today as a panelist from Australia. Thanks, everybody. I appreciate that. And thank you to the audience for bearing with us. I'm going to hand over to Raul from Merck to close us out. So Raul, if you're online, over to you, sir.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you so much, David. Well, sad, but the session is coming to an end. So I would like to thank the GSDA presidents for their candid reflections, their insights, and the obvious passions that they bring into their countries' roles. And not only that, as you heard on the final comments, the global supply diversity movement that we need to drag here. A big thank to everyone that joined us today. Also, David, thank you for your leadership, for guiding the conversations, not only today, but for all the 3 sessions that we hosted throughout, the last couple of weeks. I hope that all of you had gained a lot of knowledge and insights about the global supply diversity movement. And as we move into a new normal, or the new way we will navigate life beyond the lockdown, please assure that GSDAs will continue to promote supply diversity globally. Remember that the next GSDA's event will be the Global Trade Show event that will be happening on October 14, 2020. So please be in the lookout for emails. So we will be providing more information about that event. So stay tuned. And again, thank you for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you all again at the October 14 virtual trade show. Take care and be safe.
Thank you, Raul, and good evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you all. Well done.
Thank you, guys.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you. Bye.
Nedra.
Bye. Good night.
Good night.